podcast.
Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. How are you feeling today?
Yeah, great, thanks.
Relaxed?
Yeah, very. Salud.
So maybe Kitty, we could start just by learning where you come from and how did you end up in the art world?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from London. I grew up in the countryside in England, on the coast, on the East Coast. I studied illustration in London, and then after working as a textile designer, did a postgraduate, and since 2022, I've been a painter.
Yeah, you made an interesting jump, I guess, from being in impression and how was that jump to textile and then to painting?
Well, it was exciting. It was much more it's much more expressive painting. You're working with a similar craft and skill, but the ideas are so much more expressive rather than decided by a client or preconceived by me. Or so it's more experimental and more interesting for me.
Yeah. So you feel like in painting you actually have a way to adapt or express yourself and adapt later and sort of like move with each brush stroke, I suppose, and find out what the outcome is with time.
Yeah, it's like a back and forth that develops in a series of different headspaces when I'm revisiting and spending more time with the piece. Whereas with design, I think it's more like sort of the idea comes from one place.
Okay.
Maybe two if it was the client and the designer. But the painting is like all the different sides of my head talking to each other.
Okay. Yeah.
Like
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
mad.
Yeah. Like a mad person.
Yeah.
Sounds fun though. And so what do you think you brought to from like those disciplines, let's say? So like what have you added to painting from your textile practice or your impression?
I think that you're always reducing things into solid shapes when you're printing, and that's quite useful for how you can build an oil painting. So I think I'm considering the like simplification of a shape.
Okay.
Still in a similar way.
Okay. But did it affect you, like, for example, in your style? Do you feel like you began with an idea of what painting was and then you became a bit more expressive? Or what has been that progression from,
I think
also
like
that discipline?
there was like no ounce of abstraction in my work while I was designing. The whole point is to clarify, not to abstract. So the moment I started painting, you're kind of looking like a poem. You're looking to make things more kind of abstracted in the hope that the ideas are more relatable to more people because they're not so specific about one experience. They're more like a universal emotion.
Yeah, and I guess in printing you have to brand it, as you say, and sort of make it digestible very fast.
Yeah.
And for sure, art has that quality of being somehow extremely complex at times or extremely simple at times, but it always lets you sort of hanging. You're always waiting to discover another layer of what's going on in some good paintings. I feel like that's what distinguishes some masterworks to others. No?
Yeah, I think that's true. It obviously varies a lot. I mean, I grew up loving David Hockney and thinking about his work, and it's quite literal what he's saying.
Yeah.
It's just a depiction, and that's closer to illustration than it is to painting in a way, although he is, of course, kind of remembered as a painter or known as a painter.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think.
But some other big figures have also started from sort of more design, foundations. No, like Bacon, I believe he was also making mats and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's got inevitably quite often how you earn your living as well, and it's or how you like approach the art world, because it's quite alien as an idea while you're at school that you're going to be kind of in a room just like indulging yourself in expressing. It helped me definitely to arrive at that before that by just learning to use the materials and develop techniques and to not think about the ideas initially, but just think about the craft.
Okay. Interesting. Well, not everyone comes from that background, so I guess it's always we're always curious to find out what happens, when you coalesce these two disciplines or three or come from another background. So I'm the director of JAWS here in Mexico City, and we are having a show with you on the 12th of December for anyone that is able to see this before the inauguration, of course, come. But what is your idea with the paintings right now? For like what you're actually making for that exhibition? What motivates you there?
Well, I started making this body of work when I did the residency with Joss in May, and I've always found Mexico City really inspiring visually. Like the combination of architectural colors informs my palette in a way that immediately changes the way I work here as opposed to London. And I think
Why? What happens in that
it's just
transition?
And the light is so much less direct. It's so kind of diffuse and grey in London, and immediately you see like shadows and the way that colors work with each other in a completely different way here. So that definitely like is a huge part of like how the work feels specifically Mexican or inspired by Mexico. And the work that I was making, beginning in May, it began with some ideas because I was reading The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche, and I was thinking about like kind of a primal oneness and kind of like grabbing forms out of like a nothingness. And it really helped in trying to find the images in the paint, because I was at the time quite kind of stilted making smaller pieces. So I kind of made these huge pools of color that were much bigger format. And then, I started to kind of like make narratives out of these pools of color in quite an automatic way. And then when Elizabeth approached me to do a duo show at the gallery, I was put in conversation with Andrea Villalon, and she and I were both interested in the text, The Labyrinth of Solitude by Octavio Paz. And there were lots of overlapping themes for me. And I think
with Nietzsche.
Yeah, particularly in that idea of the primal oneness and the Dionysiac spirit.
Sure, yeah.
It kind of matched so much with the ideas of the fiesta and the Mexican people coming together to
it's true.
And so I think it's those texts that form the kind of backbone of ideas for this body of work that I'm showing in a few weeks. And it was interesting for me to make half of it in London and half of it in Mexico.
Yeah.
I think that there's a kind of like dreaming of Mexico from afar, and like working from sketches and photographs is one thing, but actually being here and noticing small things about quotidian life and then including them was something I really felt was important. So I'm glad that I'm finishing off the work.
No, that's great.
Now.
Just as a reference for the audience, so Kitty is mentioning The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher, really well-known philosopher from the 19th century and mid-20th century. That book specifically speaks about these two impulses, right? Like the Dionysian impulse, which is sort of related to party, pleasure, orgy, wine, it's sort of like this transcendence, and the Apollonian impulse, let's say, or instinct. I think in the German is Triebe, so it's like drive, actually, which is really what he regarded as some type of order, the structure, a bit of militantism that we might have, and that he was mentioning in his perhaps earliest works. No. But it's interesting that you're adding that dimension to the Mexican sort of idea of like what partying is, or not partying, but fiesta, Somehow it feels very different in English, but and Octavio is clearly a fascinating thinker who meant so much to Mexico during the post-revolution time, sort of already when Mexico was established, and until the end of the 90s, he was really prescient thinker in Mexico. So I find it interesting that you guys chose that text. I mean, clearly it's a classical Mexican literary work, but also an incredible essay. Some Mexicans enter into conflict immediately when you mention Octavio Paz.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how that moves forward after during and after the exhibition, you know.
I know. I think it's interesting also because we're both women, but because Andrea's Mexican and I'm British, we were thinking about like including another text to kind of throw it away or off. But actually, it was quite interesting. Like, I think that now in a time of like woke culture, people are too keen to like, if they disagree with something, not take it into account. But it is just a point of view written in a completely different time.
Yeah.
And I find it still, there are like universal themes in it that are interesting, whether you're a woman now or like a British woman, a Mexican woman. I guess those were the two standpoints that we were discussing it from. But we were talking about it in London. Andrea was telling me about her upbringing in Michoacan, and yeah, I think it's something that I read when I first came to Mexico in 2016, and it feels like a completely different text. Because culture's changed so much, and because I'm 8 years older too.
Yeah, and I guess more layers are added with time and with this book because there's new interpretations of it. Like, I mean, maybe before moving to more on your interest in Mexico, no, I would also like to mention like Octavio Paz was like loved by the left in Mexico, and he sort of like appropriated his own version of what the left meant back in the 1940s, 30s when the Soviet Union was rising. But then he started seeing like, and I mean maybe it causes a lot of trouble with people that recognize him more as an extreme left thinker, but the extreme left didn't like him. They thought he was a traitor of the left because he started criticizing the gulags in the Soviet Union back in the day. But also he was very severe with the right. So he's an interesting thinker because of that. Like he created a lot of conflict within the country. I mean, he created like different cultural movements. He was part of this like sort of Mexican identity creation movements from mid 20th century. And he was also the ambassador of Mexico in India, which is kind of an intriguing story that maybe we can discuss with time later on. But yeah.
Can I ask you what changed in the 90s in terms of the reaction to him?
He was, I think, ambassador in India, like way later. He was placed there by a president. I don't remember which presidency was in place, but they sent him also because they didn't want him causing trouble here, because he had like a magazine, 2 magazines actually, like culture magazines, and that some political members were not so happy about him, like saying so many things against like the actual government or pro or against, because he was a bit of a neutral character. And I think like in the end of his life is probably when he received the most acclaim, because he won like the Nobel like laureate, I think in 1990. But he was just, I mean, still he's revisited and he's criticized, but anyone in Mexico who is like sort of in a more like philosophical or intellectual endeavor has to accept that he marked the way for a type of writer and just thinker of a kind that didn't exist here before him. No, so he made possibilities be seen, and so I think. Like any big character in history, he was like creating sort of ambiguous feelings all around. So, yeah. But I'm happy that you're bringing this text. I think, even though it's an old text, we can still read it today, as you say, as you've been influenced by it, and sort of still have the work impact our identity, our philosophy. Like how should we think of ourselves, universally, you know. So yeah. What are your thoughts on him as a this kind of weird character? Is it more fascinating even?
I don't know if it's something that I've like been particularly aware of because of not growing up here.
Yeah.
I mean, it felt like a kind of seminal text to read on arriving, like Under the Volcano, like something that when you arrive, people say
Out of the
they
volcano.
suggest it, you know?
Lovely.
But whereas, so I guess I just read it on suggestion. I was aware that he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize, but I didn't actually know a whole lot about him. I think I was looking at his ideas from the text and quite often just using them as starting points to then kind of start thinking on top of. So yeah, I guess it's just the more general themes as opposed to specifics of his personal history for me.
It's valid, no, to have that sort of ideas move you in a way that where you can sort of feel them and sort of change your mind about things.
I'm interested though, like since making this body of work in the conversations I've had with people, because as you say, people immediately have a big reaction to him.
Oh yes.
And lots of people, I was speaking to a Mexican man last week who said he really didn't feel like he related to the description of being Mexican in any way. And I'm sure I'll have lots of interesting conversations subsequently, like in either direction.
Yeah, I've heard that criticism
so I'm glad
as well.
To just like open it as
no, but you know, as you know, I was giving some tours in the gallery some weeks ago, and you know, there was an artist who entered and saw one work and thought it was terrifying, where everyone else had told me it was a lovely piece and very relaxing. So I feel like whenever someone has a strong sort of instinctual reaction against or pro something, it's just interesting to see that, you know, specifically in the art world, where clearly what you're creating is somehow like, yeah, it's, as you say, you're adapting, and a bit of it is unconscious to an extent, or there's like some practice, you know, some habits that you're placing already there, but you're kind of bringing things from, I don't know, like somewhere, you know. And I find it interesting that they have such a shocking experience, you know, every time, like, oh no, I hate this, so it means nothing to me.
Yeah.
Clearly it does mean something to you, you know? So you came to Mexico in 2016, and what was your main like attraction to Mexico back then?
I came to visit Edward James's garden, Las Posas, in Gilitla, and
in San Luis Potosí, yeah.
I think I was really interested in all the Europeans who'd moved to Mexico in the 40s, like pre-Second World War. Lots of visual, like, and literary stuff that I was interested in seemed to be coming through Mexico. And so I came to visit and then met lots of people who worked in art and design, and was based here for a while, like, because it's a really interesting city also to be trying out creative ideas in. There's so much scope for working with like small studios and like, but yeah, I think it's those early surrealists that were my initial draw to the country, basically. Like Remedios Varo and Leonore Carrington and Sylvia Pardo and people like that.
Yeah, and that labyrinth, the stairway, no, in Gilitla is it's mind blowing. Yeah, I'm just fascinated that people also come to Mexico to do this kind of projects. You know, I know like they were fleeing the war back in the day, but you know, it's just fascinating to see like how their imagination was enriched by this place, which is always magical, always has something going on.
Yeah,
and the city is just.
I think it's very like galvanizing and exciting and inspiring. Definitely, it's so much more kind of chaotic than the UK feels.
Yeah, well, makes sense.
I mean, it's not like the UK's in a great state, but like it's more.
So how do you see that, for example, that difference between coming from, I don't know, what do you see are the qualities in Britain? What do you see are the qualities in Mexico?
In comparison?
Yeah.
I think there's a definite, if you just think about how people drive, there's like, people are so obedient in the London. You like follow the rules, you know? Whereas here it's like intuitive and you like dive and like jump.
You have to dive, otherwise you're not advancing much either.
I feel like there's a kind of indirectness about, like, with friends who are Mexican that I find very different to British friends.
Mm.
But I guess the sunlight makes things just completely different and much more kind of, that definitely changes the pace and makes me much happier immediately.
Yeah, it's crazy, no?
Yeah.
Just a little bit of sun,
Yeah,
some 20 degrees, it's okay already.
so much better.
Yeah. Would you say that you have a more Apollonian like instinct, if we would use Nietzsche's allegories,
Well, and
I
then it
suppose?
becomes more Dionysiac when I get here.
No, that here we have a more Dionysiac.
Yeah, I
experience,
probably would say that.
and they're more Apollonian. It's very structured, very ordered. You must not say some things, and we are a bit like loose on the tongue sometimes.
Yeah, but there is like a politeness and indirectness that makes people not say something as well.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
guess.
For sure.
You know, that people kind of say and then apologize in British more, you know, rather than.
Uh,
Oh, I don't really know. I feel really basic describing the difference.
no, it's cool. So do you feel, so mainly the sun, you say, inspires you in Mexico, but
I think the light is just so crisp
light.
and direct, and it makes a huge difference. Like, I saw an amazing show in Hastings in the UK, and it was Soutine and not Auerbach. I remember the other artist, but it's such a London and European feeling of kind of dirty, grubby, like sort of colours all blurring into each other, and it was Leon Kossoff was the other artist, but here I just feel like when I first started painting on the side of making textiles here, I made such kind of crisp distinctions between everything, and definitely thought about color. You can't not think about color here.
No. Gives you color.
Yeah.
For sure. And, you know, in another interview with Alois Kronschläger, who it was the first episode we had, he also mentioned that he is a very abstract painter, for example, and you know, grows his career he grew his career in New York, and so his way of making abstraction, he mentioned, was like just thinking of like the skyscrapers and the squareness of things and sort of like this super ultra abstract stuff. And then he mentions, when I came to Mexico, I discovered color as well. So I think it's somehow a fascinating thing to remark on, coming from Europe, because I feel it makes sense. Of course, it's a bit more gray, definitely, the weather, and perhaps people also get somehow more introspective or sort of close to their ideas. And here you have to sort of, you're part of it all, no? It's like,
yeah, so you're less objective to
exactly,
to how that color seems. I know.
exactly.
I feel lucky to be able to arrive and see it as this newness, and that was interesting to be painting in the London light and then to be painting in Mexico. And also Andrea's paintings are very vivid and bright color-wise, and it feels like she's kind of thinking of Mexico even more brightly than it is, and while she paints it from London.
Okay, yeah.
But I think the colors are really interesting together, because it's definitely something that ties our work together.
And I mean, you come from an inverse situation, no? You both are living in London, but you come here and paint here, and she stays there and remembers it. So there's like a weird sense of like nostalgia that you both had when you were creating these paintings, like during your time there. And now you come here and it feels, as you say, like it feels more the details, the devil's in the detail, no? So it's like you have to incorporate it to the context.
Yeah. And for me also, my paintings are really driven by draftsmanship. So being here and painting, like spending the morning drawing in pencil and then turning those drawings into color and into a painting, it's really different than painting from a photograph in London. With like a combination of reference and memory. I mean, both are interesting, but I really value looking at the shadows so specifically with a direct drawing by being here.
And what's your approach to that area? Like, do you usually base your painting on observation or more like internal feelings, or they enmesh at some point?
I think what I do is I kind of input a series of ideas based on what I'm reading or the films that I'm watching at the time, or like people around me that I'm spending a lot of time with. And then I try and, at the point of beginning the painting, I try and kind of forget everything and move quite intuitively, like I'm pulling figures, forms out of sort of nothing, out of an abyss. And then as things start to form, the paint almost reminds me of those initial ideas. And then I move back into reference. So I kind of try and lose a conscious feeling of what the compositions are about. But then it kind of reveals the ideas to me better that way, because almost like we were just saying about arriving somewhere objectively, I kind of stand back and look at it and then
Revisit subjectively somehow and then come back to the objective side.
having tried to forget it in the meantime.
Interesting.
But it's funny how you can do that with paint. It's strange, like it really can feel like another person, an extra person in the conversation. You're really kind of arguing with it, like getting answers from it.
Yeah, you have a dialogue, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's, I guess it's interesting, this layering you're doing, because of course, like being so theoretical at the start, you have to sort of get loose, or let loose, I don't know. Coming back to the book of like El Laberinto de Soledad, the Labyrinth of Solitude, over there. What themes motivate you, and why they motivate you in such way? Or I don't know if.
I guess the biggest one is the fiesta theme. I think it's something that you just feel immediately in being here. I feel like I paint and party like I'm here in a good balance.
In London, not so good balance?
London is more separated. But I think that it is, I think that's the theme that I come back to the most. The idea of like the masks that he describes in the Day of the Dead section in the book, of being able to kind of lose yourself through partying in another persona and all becoming one, rather than, and having the kind of scope to think that you can be something else for that, even if it's for that time. I think it's a really interesting idea. And I think when you're painting, you're making images of illusion, so it fits so well with that idea that you're kind of deciding on these illusory forms all the time. And so it's kind of like being on a dance floor. You're kind of like trying out being something else.
Creating masks all day long.
Yeah.
I guess some context for this, I believe like Octavio Paz said something like that in the fiesta, the Mexicans tend to find transcendence and finally leave themselves, leave perhaps the solitude of oneself in the identity, collective identity of the Mexican. And then in the fiesta, finally sort of go out of yourself and then sort of talk with everyone, shout, cry, kill, die, and sort of have this, I don't know, crazy experience, which I guess we all get it. At some point we get too much mezcal and it's okay. Okay, but the mask is interesting to you because it has this double meaning. It's showing you like perhaps a persona, but also a disguise.
I think it's just also a really timeless idea that you can see through all cultures, and that's why, like, that's the part of the text that feels most relevant. The latest painting I've been working on is a kind of idea of like the Dionysiac through time, and it's different art history references as well as contemporary like images of people dancing around me. But there's always been that need in any culture, in so many cultures, for like that need for abandon and like being outside society and status and like, I mean, gender. Octavio Paz says, and like you can kind of get outside everything that constrains you to what makes you feel trapped in yourself. And I think that, like the Bacchus is like an example that I get shown often in the art history that I've seen, like growing up in it.
Yeah, it's a great reference for sure. I mean, I enjoyed the Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche's theory in general, but it's interesting you mentioned that. It makes me somehow remember like some funny thought like about, well, it's kind of a factual thing, but like of the past, like when apparently the New Year's Eve celebration started, it actually was, I think, maybe in Sumer or something, like the Western version for sure. And apparently, like there was a day where too many people had accumulated too much debt, so they had to invent some type of situation where you would sort of free everyone from their debt to the world, to the gods, to the universe. And somehow it reminds me of this conversation, like that Dionysic is always this sort of impulse to, okay, let's just restart, reboot, and
regenerate.
Yeah, regenerate, and surely it has to do with the seasons as well, like this whole idea.
Yeah, but he mentions also how like there's a real distinction between like recreation and recreation, and that the idea of going to the party to like finish the year, to like set everything straight, to spend everything, so you need to make more, and to like get rid of everything, so you're starting afresh.
Yeah,
it's been kind of confused in an individualistic idea of of recreation, which is actually very much still based on consumption in the wrong ways. But recreation would actually be like setting yourself anew, but we've sort of lost that. But there are times that it's worth noting you still do reach that through, and I guess it is like dancing and that kind of state of oneness, whether it's intoxicated or not, but just that kind of unity of like being more.
We had another guest in the podcast some couple of months ago, Chaxel Rogen, who is like a Mayan mathematician, and he mentioned that like the real reason why Dia de Muertos exists is because it was like the day that everything sort of I guess went through this process into the underworld, but to be reborn again. So it's just like an agricultural reference, that we don't perhaps think of like as much today because we're so abstracted from our daily lives, but it's sort of strange, huh? So mainly the party, la fiesta, and la máscara is your inspiration for these new paintings.
Yeah, I think also when he describes the post-revolution kind of establishment of Mexico's national identity, it's so interesting seeing the national pride in the city. I think you see it around Mexico City, particularly when you're in a cantina or a restaurant. You see this kind of layered history visually through time. You can see tiles from a colonial like period of like the building belonging to that, and then you see a kind of plastic chair of today and like a sort of socializing working class place to be. I think you see those layers of national identity through time more than you would in London or somewhere where it's a bit sort of, I mean, obviously it's different because it's a place that was colonizing, not being colonized, but still, I think you see maybe more like in India, you see sort of different evolutions of transport all in the same place at once, like a fancy new car as well as a
but even in the case of like Brits, I find it interesting, like for example, tea coming from like Asia and like it being adapted to the culture and then it creating some type of layering in like how you had to drink tea, for example, or behave in a drinking tea or at what time, how are you dividing your time because of tea. So I feel like it's funny how I guess these cultural layers are all mixed up and sort of brought together
I think I'm struck by coming back to Mexico as well, like post-pandemic, how much you see a sort of like international like sort of aesthetic on top of the Mexican city, so much more so. And so in one of my paintings, there's a reference to like a kind of a handbag that just keeps coming up on my algorithm. And it's this really just like homogenized taste of like a crappy handbag, But that kind of combined with like a international cocktail. But then in the background, as you look closer into the painting, you can see that there's like someone in traditional like
Mexican garments.
Garments, maybe with like a machete, like walking in the background. But it's so crazy in the city that you do see those things at the same time. And I don't think you get that simultaneous visual experience in many places. I feel like it is something that is specific to here.
I guess specifically in Europe, I feel like most likely, well, I mean, in Flanders, for example, you do feel like, okay, you can still see like Van Eyck and Bruegel's paintings basically on the streets when everyone's drunk on beer, So it's like the folklore comes back and the Dionysiac sort of impulse is there, and it's still eternal somehow. Like it's not changing much from like the past, no? So, but yeah, I guess it's sort of absorbs like this whole notion of modernity and contemporary world, and consumerist world, like in a, I don't know, maybe it absorbed it with time in difficult ways, but now it feels like it's just one of, it's one part of it.
And I also think that in Mexico, there's because of the like amazing sort of triumph of the revolution. I think there's a sense of like of proving the national identity in a really clear way. Because I think if you're British, you're like sort of hiding your past, So there's more guilt in the visual. Like, I mean, people are kind of tapping into pagan rituals and ideas now more visually as a way of like avoiding appropriation, as a way of like understanding our indigenous culture. But I think that you do see a kind of, because of Mexico having to establish itself in like 1910, like so strong, I think you see it when you go to Oaxaca, like loads, or Chiapas, or different places that I think are really flagging up the cultural history in a way that you just might not see as obviously in rural Britain. I think you'd be in a pub with a mixture of people, but you wouldn't see someone in the same clothes eating the same food on the same type of object, like you can here in such a extraordinary way when you see people with like chickens under their arm from the market going.
Especially in San Cristobal de las Casas.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's funny. I guess I mean, I think you're right. Like Mexico City, specifically as a reference, I think has such a surreal combination of like things like that are clearly, like as you say, consumers, contemporary world where you could find these in Shanghai or New York, or it wouldn't matter like where you were, you could find these references, but at the same time carry this sort of desire for a strong identity in the cantina, or I don't know, there's like different places where this is happening, but also I don't know, I feel like it's all of it is blending together in a really weird way, but I think that's what makes I guess the city different to others, and most likely unique in that way. Because I feel like the for sure the revolution was, I mean, it's at times glorified, at times it's criticized, at times like Octavio Paz also thought that there was a weird ambivalency, like between being too pro like revolution or too much against, but he criticized both sides. So it's interesting. When I saw a bit of your work, I mean, for those who might come to the exhibition, I did have this idea in my head that you were using also this notion of Don Nadie that like Octavio Paz is expressing when he's saying, like, when, for example, when Mexicans use the word chingar, or the verb, we say it with everything, and it has this weird like ambivalency as well, like of being like a call to nothingness, a call to the lost mother, the lost like mythological all, and at the same time like it can be a good thing. No, it's like good and bad, and you can be a chingon and you can chingar someone, and so it's a fascinating linguistic term that he is utilizing to talk about our identity, as in we tend to be ambivalent people who like to be between nothingness and being, you know, like sort of. I remember this very brief description he has of like a very Mexican moment when you enter a house in Mexico and somebody shouts, "¿Quién está ahí?" You know, and you're like, "Nadie, soy yo."
I know.
So it's
Yeah,
like
that was really struck by that.
a hilarious example of saying like, yeah, well, sort of nothing. I am nobody, but I am here as well. But so like,
Yeah,
I find
nobody's
that
here, just
sort
me.
of very playful of him. Like, and I feel like your work that somehow camouflages to the background has that experience of speaking of like Don Nadie almost at the same time.
Yeah, I think the decision to not put features into some of the faces is something that I kind of rest heavily on. It's really hard to know which is going to feel more resonant to the point. I think sometimes having no expression gives a better space for projection. Someone can kind of imagine anyone as that figure. And in the cantina scene, that's a restaurant scene, the two male figures are expressionless. But I think you still have, I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting to me that people make up different interpretations of it. I guess you provide that better. But I guess that feeling of there being someone there. I think the chair becomes a kind of metaphor in my paintings for the presence of someone and their absence. The kind of groups of being together or one separated maybe slightly plays into that same idea of it being someone, a space to imagine someone being, but they aren't there at the same time. I guess because it's such an obvious anthropomorphical kind of gesture. You immediately imagine that scenario.
But it speaks well for your painting, I think, because it gives you, like, we can project our imagination into it, and you know, as we were saying before, like whoever has a strong reaction to it or not, or loves it, it's all interesting for an artist, no?
I think also sometimes I'm painting from my memory, and therefore it's more likely to be a face I've seen a million times, and so I can kind of. It makes more sense to work from that side of my brain and leave the parts of it unresolved than to need to like paint from a Mexican face in front of me within this time. So I guess that's the point at which it becomes more autobiographical. Sometimes if there's a figure that represents something within the idea, they kind of have to be about my life. Otherwise, it doesn't feel natural.
Yeah, in a way, in your paintings, you're Mr. Nobody, basically.
Yeah, I guess so. At that point, Miss Nobody.
Yeah, Miss Nobody. It's a cool name. Maybe you should call one of them like that.
Yeah.
So were you aware that there's, I think we spoke about this briefly before, but that there are like these weird British references in Mexican culture, like I think we spoke about the pastes, you know, like that around Guanajuato, Michoacán, all these things, like they call them that way because they were pastry, right? Like, and also like there's quite a few textile factories around Mexico that were first built by the Brits when they were here. So I find it's interesting because they've now sort of become part of the urban scape, I guess. But they are still like a big factor in here. But I guess like it's also the case with in Argentina, for example, where they also have like a similar pastes scenario. But what do you think of this stuff? Like that is
pasties or factories?
Pastes. Yeah. Both, I guess. Like because it's textile as well, so it's kind of comes from a very clearly somehow maybe problematic context, I'm not sure, but somehow it's also interesting that it became part of our identity to an extent, so it's very strange.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're quite different things. The textile
Of
factories,
course,
where
yeah.
are they like in Veracruz or like in the
Yeah, many
north?
places. Veracruz, you have in Michoacán, literally the Javier Marin, the sculptor, is like recovered one that was made in I think it's in Uruapan in Michoacán.
Oh yeah, that's what we're talking about.
But it's interesting. I think also like around Merida there might be some, but yeah, it's funny, it's strange, but it feels like almost like a ruin as well.
Yeah,
You know?
but so does the structure inform the way that any of those textiles were made? Do you think, or
Yeah, all the
it's just
instruments
the
are British. All like the manufacturing tools are British.
wow? I mean, I don't know enough about it because when I was making small amounts here, I was screen printing just in the north of the city. But I
Okay.
guess I did choose to like stick to techniques that were probably more European than they were Mexican. Like I didn't move into weaving. I did
Right.
go and visit people who were making cotton in Oaxaca, but I never got into weaving.
Yeah.
But I guess that those vernaculars change. I mean, I guess I'm kind of interested in like pigment and how that reoccurs. I think I went to see an exhibition about how cobalt blue was used like in Europe and in Japan and China, and then how it moves over to Mexico, and you see it in all that.
Yeah.
Pueblo
Or I think
ceramics.
indigo here was made by the Mayans, and then it was brought to Europe and also became like a big thing, like for the Low Countries painters and also.
Yeah, I mean cochineal as a pigment, like you can see it in galleries in in England, like the National Gallery. You can see where cochineal like started to come from Spain back to Europe, like from Mexico, but by the Spanish back to Europe, and it's an amazingly strong color.
Have you tried pastes? No.
What kind? Like a Cornish pasty, do you mean? Or is it just called a pasty?
Paste? No, it's like I guess like some type
Like
of
pastry with meat inside it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I've tried them in the UK. I'm not sure I have here.
No, you should. I think it's gonna
Like
be
an empanada, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like our version of empanada, but
Yeah.
we still call it paste.
And they're from the north, specifically.
No, sort of like you can also find it here in some places in Mexico
I'll have to
City.
look out.
Yeah,
You'll
I'll
have
bring
to
you
show me
to
where.
some paste store. So coming back to your formation in the UK, where did you study first textile?
I studied illustration at
Illustration.
London College of Communication,
Okay.
part of University of the Arts, and it felt like at the time that's where you could draw all the time, because fine art was more conceptual and installation based. So I come from a family of artists, each of whom use their drawing skills in an applied way.
And everyone's drawing, or do you have someone else doing something different?
We all draw and paint at the root of it, but like one is a theatre designer or a illustrator or
Cool.
designing ceramics, so the same skill goes into like different applications.
Awesome.
So it took a while for me to find the space to like not apply it, to choose to go away from that.
Yeah.
So I think that was definitely why it took me until a few years ago to make it my primary practice.
And so when you think back maybe to your painting practice or to that time, do you have any professors or teachers or that you remember fondly and that you could mention?
I think
and what they taught you maybe?
I think my big influences come from like reading about other artists. Philip Guston really changed my mind completely about everything. I went to the Royal Drawing School to do my postgraduate 2 years ago, and there were amazing tutors there who were practicing artists. There was one called Thomas Newbolt who changed my ideas on things a lot in making the work be subjective, basically. For the first time I sort of understood it in his class. But Philip Guston made me aware of the picture plane and the illusion of paint in a way that I just couldn't understand at all before then. And his approach to allegory is really so interesting when you're trying so hard to prove your skill of observational accuracy, and actually knowing that painting is something so different. Drawing is kind of gathering information, but the painting is kind of, you know, like moving away from the clarity and abstracting into something that has more meaning.
Oh, interesting.
But I think Philip Guston definitely changed that for me. And then Rothko, and thinking about how Rothko moved from his early amazing. Did you see the show in Paris by any chance that was last year?
No.
It was incredible. But seeing him learning to draw and then sort of losing the figures bit by bit and turning it into abstraction is so fascinating. I don't think I will ever necessarily be an abstract artist, but seeing the point where I'm on the brink of it is so interesting.
Transitioning.
Yeah. And I don't know if I will transition, but there's definitely moments even within my very figurative work where things abstract, even if it isn't the whole piece.
Yeah.
I think there's
interesting. I didn't know that Rothko, that he was sort of reteaching himself how to forget, I suppose, like or forgetting how to what he was taught.
Well, you just see it like evolve into these simplifications of shapes that then become proportions of color, and how those relative proportions make the sensation that give you the emotion you're trying to achieve. So it's so different than trying to illustrate an idea and lead someone holding their hand around the narrative that's very straightforward, you know? It's a completely different way of connecting with your viewer, I guess.
Right. Yeah, there's this aesthetic philosophy writer, I guess, called Herder, like German guy. And he said something like really close to what you just mentioned, that where he said, like, well, to make good art, you must understand like what each sort of art school is dedicated to do. So like whoever is focused on the optics, you know, has to be not the best observer, but the best at illusion.
Right.
It's like whoever is into sculpture has to be the best at making things tangible for someone, but perhaps also helping that view with an illusion or whatever. But someone blind had to see it for him, you know. Or I mean, music for the ear, and just like the dream, you know. And I don't know, that he had an interesting, just aesthetic theory that I still think resonates with me today, at least. But I feel like most likely you would resonate with a lot of artists that are doing like different disciplines, you know.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. I'd like to read about it.
You thought of another topic about Laberinto de la Soledad that you want to discuss?
Yeah, another thing I was thinking of is right at the beginning, how he describes the awareness of the self. And I think that's something that is, I think in the book he says the moment you dream you're dreaming, the moment of awakening is here, or like words to that effect. And that kind of like
elevation, sensation.
Well, from I guess it would be your super ego thinking, if you're in Freudian terms of consciousness, you know, so you're aware of being. But I guess that's something that painting suits that philosophical idea quite well, because because things are shapes, and then you sort of acknowledge them turning into a real thing. I don't know.
Like a form.
Yeah. And I guess it's like Walter Benjamin have you read what's it called, Berlin Childhood? And he talks about realizing the idea of the self when he's a child. I think he's walking along between his parents holding their hands, and they talk about the age that they are. He realizes the age he is, and that like relativity between those two numbers makes him realize the existence of him. But I guess it's similar to the beginning of the book, and how you feel that sense of self. That's definitely a theme that kind of interested me.
No, but I mean, it makes sense when you put it in painting somehow. It makes more sense even, because I guess you do start from, just a mere sort of, I'm not sure, even an idea, some weird.
Or just marks and
yeah,
movement
yeah.
are like
A pattern
often how I
almost,
begin
maybe.
something. Yeah. And then I'll kind of stand back and start to form it into an awareness. And it's like that feeling when you're growing up and this sort of independence away from, I don't know, what you're nurtured by and feeling part of. You suddenly separate yourself from it. But I guess the title of Fractured Solitudes is, ideas on how that, a kind of positive take on alienation and ideas on loneliness and the self. But
Yeah.
I don't know, you came up with that as a suggestion, as a title.
Yeah, with many possible titles.
Yeah.
I think with your exhibition and his work. I don't know how to relate.
I think it fits nicely though.
titles.
I think we came to a good idea because of those thoughts on the
So
self.
the title of the exhibition is Soledades Fracturadas, which I guess it makes sense, specifically coming from both your contexts, no? Where like Andrea Villaloni is more like melancholic and sort of fractured because she's away of like her identity, her place of birth, and you have this situation in London. Clearly, London is like a very cosmopolitan place, or for UK as well, no? So it's like tons of people looking different and coming from so many cultures and backgrounds, that I guess also that sort of experience of feeling like a local can be complicated.
Yeah. I think about the title as well in relation to how I feel here on arrival. I think there's a really interesting sense of being alone when you're somewhere voluntarily, I'm here like to paint, to learn, to meet people, and that like voluntary aloneness is obviously I have agency, and so there's a completely different feeling as opposed to being made to be lonely for other reasons.
Sure, yeah. It's kind of strange topic. Makes me nostalgic always, this book, maybe of my adolescence, because I read it when I was like 20 or 19, so going back to maybe art history and like your fascination into these like different periods. So what periods in art history are of your interest mainly? Like
probably like abstract expressionism. For the last few years, it's been what I found most interesting. I think.
You mean like what? Which years specifically?
So I guess that's like 30s to 60s or something.
Okay.
I might be wrong, but I guess it's that time in New York, particularly. Like,
Pollock time.
Yeah, and de Kooning and Rothko and Rauschenberg, but particularly Guston, who like chooses to not be associated with them. But
why does he do that?
Well, because he just happens to be. I think he's Canadian, but grew up in California.
Okay.
And then was in Mexico quite a lot in his early 20s. But he kind of happened to be abstract because of his fascination with going away from the need to depict a form or something. I don't know. I guess I sort of explained it better earlier, but I guess people are just keen to include people in movements, aren't they? It's maybe easier for the art scene. I think his gallery at the time were really surprised because he had this exhibition lined up. He was known amongst the abstract expressionists, and then he'd moved on to the next stage of his life, which was going back into figuration, having left it aside for the abstract period. And they were very disappointed and kind of like betrayed that he'd gone away from the abstraction. But if you're painting in such a dedicated way like he was, those stages of progress are what make you a active and engaged, evolving painter. I hate to think that this is how I'll paint forever. So Guston's a really interesting person to look at because he's so busy and so progressive all the time.
Yeah.
And then I also am really interested in Nicole Eisenman and how she picks up where he left off.
Okay.
She's like a New York painter, sort of making performance pieces in the 90s, and the way that she makes a kind of comment on the canon of figurative painting, like he did, but then extending it into a kind of witty take on just the funny reality that a painting is just a flat surface. So sometimes she just puts a big kind of splodge of oil paint that makes you suddenly aware that it's just an illusion. But then her kind of skills are so adept that she can kind of make the illusion of the picture plane go into whole depth, and she references a Renoir scene in a restaurant and takes you into a depth of sort of history, as well as feeling like that flat canvas is turning into a sort of expansive space. And I think Piero de Francesco was thinking about that picture plane and geometrics behind the figures that you're seeing, and anyone that picked him up subsequently is often someone I'm interested in, because it's so exciting that you're making this kind of theatre set in front of you and you're kind of pulling out characters and a space. Sometimes my paintings are of a actual architectural interior or an exterior that feels relevant, but sometimes they're just from my head, and it's just the sense of allowing the figures to drop back into it that's important. There doesn't need to be an accuracy, but the tension that is changed in the figures by the choice of the depth that I'm depicting is what matters to me. So you just put one figure next to another, they kind of immediately, the viewer starts assuming there's some dynamic between them, but I'm just painting marks like nearby. But for me, that's why it's still interesting to be a figurative painter, not an abstract painter. But I think in time you could start to see that, like, just a red rectangle next to a blue one would do the same effect. It would just make one jump forward, which makes you start to think about separation.
Yeah. Crazy. Interesting. I read a book not so long ago on, he's an anthropologist called Jeremy Lent. Very,
I don't know him.
so beautiful, beautiful book called The Patterning Instinct. So when you say like that, like no matter, well, I guess, what he's saying is that we just develop this patterning instinct, and that's what makes us us, like as humans, special or different, slightly different. But it's always interesting to me when you say like that, just by making a few, like brush strokes, somehow the audience or the person who is looking at this painting will find some sense to it, some figure, so figuration is always fascinating in that way, for sure. But abstraction, I guess abstraction is really bizarre there, because I feel like it's actually contained in such a strict region, each form has to be very exact. But even,
Well, maybe.
you can play with that abstraction.
Yeah, it depends if it's like Pollock or like Rothko, because Rothko
more
is
expressionist,
very
of course. Yeah.
exact, whereas Pollock is just like, yeah, I don't understand him so well.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking more on like different abstract painters as well, like Hilma af Klint, and I don't know if you like her work.
Yeah, I do. I think there's a really interesting moment as well when Rothko's work is like hers, and he's thinking about these symbols, and actually if those figures have a meaning, they're more abstract than the colors that then represent those ideas. It's really strange watching that shift.
Yeah.
They look just like her funny, like, systems of science that she's trying to get her head around. And they're very like non-descriptive shapes, aren't they? I mean, they are to her, I guess. They're a whole means of understanding.
Yeah, they're like signals almost.
They don't really communicate. Or did they, to me, at least.
I know that she was like really into some, I believe, a Swiss school of like thought called no.
Or of biology, like a school of thought to do with biology.
Yeah, like ethnobotanics combined with mathematics, and then astrology, and not astronomy, astrology, and then
Yeah.
horoscopes, and then a mixed, bunch of styles. But yeah, I mean, she was quite a surprising painter, no, at her
Yeah.
time, for sure, coming up with abstraction before Kandinsky even. So yeah, I mean, I guess that period of shift after the war or just before the war is also a very bizarre thing to think of, because I feel like the world changed dramatically during that period.
Yeah.
Especially in the US, I suppose, where you see it more like the abstract expressionist.
Well, they were also well funded by the WPA, so they
Right,
actually
yeah.
we just know so much of their work. They were able to dedicate so much time to it. I guess that's why there's so many good exhibitions and so many books about them, because they were so supported by the government in a way that happens rarely, basically.
Rarely, yeah. And any other, art history epoch or style that you like, that you feel like you've got some influence from?
Well, I love the artist Lisa Bryce, who's contemporary, who's a South African painter. And while I was transitioning from illustration into painting, I think I kind of realized that the way that I approached a color was to remove white from color, because I used to paint in these monochrome, water-based sort of like glimpses, like a crop of an image. And that's how I translated moving into oil. So I would pull the white out with a cloth, like I used to leave the white out on a watercolor. And I think I saw that in Lisa Bryce's work, and it helped me shift. Because I guess also tone is the first thing that's important in a painting. So working in one color is a really useful way to it makes my mind work in the right way for depth. Yeah. So she's a really important influence for me. And she also references art history, because I think I find I'm often got hung up on the idea of choosing my subject matter, but actually you can just paint like so many scenes that already exist. It's so hard to come up with a new image. I don't think I'm gonna innovate. I don't think I'm gonna be able to come up with an image that's completely new. And
maybe not. I think.
But there's so much interest.
You might do.
But there's so much interest for me in just like looking at a really amazingly strong Caravaggio painting and working out why those figures hold the tension that they do. And immediately I'll start to project my dynamics of a life I understand onto it. Just like all of the old masters were painting religious scenes that we've seen again and again and again.
Yeah.
But the beginning point is the same composition so often, but you start to see the personality of that painter even quicker by them, kind of like a meme being a universally understood idea. A meme about like a mother putting her babies to bed makes us all laugh because we get it, just like a painting of the Virgin Mary and the Jesus was something that people immediately arrived at the point of understanding.
Yeah, it's great. I guess you are pointing at a weird return to the return to the return to the return.
Yeah.
It's like layer after layer of like art history. Yeah, I guess I've always thought it's kind of weird, like all these neoclassical like paintings, and like coming back to these origin myths that exist in perhaps more Europe, like about the Greek and the Roman after like 1,000 years of not being present. And sort of like what really was revisited were like the biblical stories, right? Like, so it's kind of fascinating. We might do that now then with a contemporary world.
Yeah, because like even Damien Hirst, when you see his like formaldehyde sculptures of a cow and a calf, it's called Mother and Child, and immediately we understand that that's a reference through time.
Right.
And anything that's kind of big and small, you can read it as that same kind of wink to history.
Yeah. I am worried at times in the art world to see exactly this fear you have, like of not seeing more
new images.
Yeah, like why wouldn't we be able to make new things?
But what I mean is, you begin at the point of the pressure of making one, and it takes it away when you're leaning on the history of it. But in a way, it can't not be a new image because it's a new hand. I mean, AI can make it not be a new image. Like that's the depressing future. But as long as it is any human that's had a different experience of the world, it can't not be different. I just mean in terms of the search. Initially, when you have a blank canvas in front of you and you're kind of beginning that
the reference
thing.
What is your whole thought about AI? Are you scared more than inspired by it?
No, I think it'll be so interesting to fight against it. I really don't find it intimidating. I think it's probably just not going to happen that they're going to replace job. Like, I don't think it's going to happen that people will be paid fairly with the what's it called, UBI or something. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there will be like terrible results for like, I think it will be really, really damaging for the workforce. But I think that creatively, I don't feel intimidated that a robot painter, like the one that's just sold, I don't feel jeopardized. Like, because I mean, it's just a phenomenon. It's not actually an interest. No one's going to look at those paintings and like be moved by them or cry, unless they're maybe like Elon Musk might be really excited to see it and start crying. But like, I'm not going to.
Okay. Well, I mean, I just think it's such a fascinating time to be around, and I always ask this in the podcast, like, what's your view on it? And it's always a bit funny because it's like everyone has clearly a very strong stance on like what the interpretation of this machine learning will be, or like if it will be able to replicate humans. I'm a bit like slightly stressed by it because I'm maybe more a writer, and when I see like actual essays or poems that an AI can create now, I'm like, it's like definitely a very different take on like what a poem is, but at the same time, because they are like language models, they do it tremendously well. But like now it's going to be a pattern model.
It might really have helped the art world how much people went into a self-led idea of what painting is, because people aren't really working in a sort of traditional way. Like music and writing relies on quite more rigid structures and forms that like make it work, right? Whereas painting, it can be a very self-taught, like instinctive thing that makes it happen. It might be a more
but I feel it's the same idea than in like what you're describing to me in painting, for example. Like I do believe like to be a good writer, you must know the writers before you, or if you want to be a good philosopher, you must know the philosophies before you, so that you are able to make your own ideas right, like work together. Somehow you need that building block.
But it would be so much harder to write, like probably a sort of William Burroughs or James Joyce copy than it would to write a Shakespeare or something that's like filled with like patterns.
I'm just terrified of the possibility that it might be the same, that it won't. Maybe it's not that hard to write a Ulysses book again, like with AI. I feel you could just give it because you can just provide the model, right? So
it makes me want to like not input too much into the world, because the more you give it, the more it'll, just only release the really good stuff, and then the AI can't compile it.
They'll be like, it's so different to the previous one. So what do you think about these big characters? For me, like when I think of like British painters, I sort of go to Turner, to Carrington because of Mexico and our connection to Britain there as well, and Bacon. So for me, these are like the painters I always think that are British, but maybe I'm like wrong, and you're.
No, I think that's a really great, like that covers quite a big range as well.
Yeah.
I think he was so important for me like a year and a half ago when
Yeah.
I saw it, a big retrospective at the Royal Academy. Yeah, the way he creates tension in a space is just wild. He's so amazing.
Yeah. I mean, you feel the anxiety for sure
Yeah.
in each painting he's ever made. It's so almost dooming, like a dooming experience now. But it's funny to think of that when maybe art was already sort of changing and sort of different, and all Dada movements were already in place, and thinking maybe of a Turner who was like a part of this industrial revolution shift towards like placing our attention to
the natural world.
Yeah, like the natural world and like the change that humans make in that uh, ecosystem atmosphere. Like I really have in my mind always like either his boats with pollution coming out,
smoke and light.
or the trains, and to me it was just like he's such a remarkable observer. I feel like, and he was already playing a bit with what you couldn't observe, so like clearly still part of that school. But
I guess he is like Diego Rivera, say, and then Bacon would be like Frida Kahlo. One is expressing like the sort of psychology of a place, and the other depicting like the political changes through time. Yeah, I guess they're really, really different artists and working at quite different times. But I think I connect more to an artist like Bacon or Frida Kahlo, who's thinking in a more about an interiority as opposed to sort of journalistically documenting times. But I know that perhaps one's more innately feminine as an approach, I mean, I think the masculine approach would be a more sequential, like recording,
a rigid documentalization of
just like a more outward way of like objective way of looking at things.
Interesting.
But Leonora Carrington is amazing because she's working so nostalgically and she's
you feel it nostalgic
so amazingly.
Yeah. What do you see? Because I don't feel that when I see like Carrington. I see like very magical beings, and I'm like, okay, I don't get the context really.
Well, I think she had quite a horrible upbringing and hated being in the north of England in this house, Crookie Hall, where she lived. And when she paints it, it's very like grey and the atmosphere is very sort of intimidating. And I think she was expected to be a kind of debutante of society and hated it. There's such a funny short story called The Hyena about her. You should read it. It's really.
I've never read it. Yeah.
She sends a hyena in her place, dressed up as a debutante, to the ball, and she's got such a funny sense of humor about her childhood and how she related to like a mythical animal world much more than the rigid society she was in, basically. But
she was also with a Spanish man, no? Or no?
German, Max Ernst, and then Cheeky Wise was Mexican, which is how she lived here.
Remedios as well, and mixing up stories.
Yeah, I think she came when Max Ernst got taken away by Nazis. She went to a mental institution in Santander.
Yes, okay.
And then there might have been a Spanish man who helped her out of Santander and took her to Mexico, but then she married Cheeky Wise. Well, maybe on arrival here or something.
Yeah, but maybe she was with this man in the
middle
in Santander or something. And, Yeah, what do you think of Carrington in a positive light?
I think when I came here, I was obsessed with her because I'd like grown up in the English countryside, then gone to art school in London, and then been in Paris for a bit, and then sort of escaped to Mexico in a totally different way, only in my own life. But I definitely was obsessed with the geography we had in common at such different times.
It's funny how that can happen with certain characters in history, where somehow we are going through a similar trajectory, and it just brings us weird nostalgia to someone from the past.
Yeah, it's so funny. You can connect through them. But I think that when I was here in 2017, I made a series of, I would call them illustrations, but they were more painterly than I used to do. But they were these depictions of Charlotte Yazbek's life in Mexico City and in Valle de Bravo. And she was a sculptor who was friends with those same surrealist women. And her great-grandfather, great-grandson is a friend of mine. And we made an exhibition about her life. And so at that time, I was really interested in a more surreal way of looking at figures and looking at sort of gravity in a painting. I like the idea of things sort of floating and how they'd transition into something else.
Yeah.
Whereas now I feel like you could sit in front of my painting and it's like you're right there. There's an immediacy that feels real. There's nothing kind of floating off into an anti-gravitational distance at any point,
Yeah. So interesting. Why did you sort of try to separate yourself from like a surrealist perspective?
But because I think you have a harder time connecting to the world if you just live, if you're sort of floating off. I think I used to be more of a dreamer. Something about the pandemic kind of pushed me back into, or maybe I lived in Mexico. I was in a different world that felt miles away. Moving back to the UK, I don't know. I'm interested in engaging like closely and immediately rather than trying to record my dreams and think about the world in that way. Okay. I'm still sort of pulling for the subconscious in the process that I was describing, but that's probably the closest I get to anything feeling non-realistic.
Like closer to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, curious. Yeah, sort of. It's funny to see, like, not in a bad way, in a good way, like how, I don't know, a style or a movement can be interpreted now. Like, I feel it's a strange moment for surrealism. Everywhere you see the 100 years of like surrealism.
Yeah.
Andre Breton, clearly Mexico had a big role in it. I mean, Dali, everyone. It's like they feel very odd to me today, like in a contemporary 21st century where sort of like even those notions of surrealism seem slightly distant to like our technological era or
But I think that surrealism came out of a time that was fearing fascism, and it's like the perfect escapism. And I think in times of war, like maybe with AI being a fear now, or with different wars happening around the world, it is always like, maybe for younger people or people who are particularly traumatized, I feel like it will always be a tool. I think that stories will always be helpful when you're not trying to like make a child feel better about something, or read to like an elderly family member when then, I think it's the same place that you're taking people to. And maybe when I was younger, I needed that more. And it's not such a necessity, but I think it will always feel relevant in some way. I think that might turn into AI in a really interesting way that could be quite beautiful. I feel like the stuff I've seen from AI on Instagram or whatever, usually it looks surreal more than anything else.
Yeah.
So I think it lends itself to a kind of, just the idea of fusing two imaginative forms.
I do feel like figuration is coming back.
Yeah.
I feel like there was definitely a hold on it for a few years, and now it's like there's so many new forms in which people are expressing themselves, and not as a like this whole like Afro movement. Kahinda Wiley is my great reference, I suppose, on that, like sort of reshaping like how historical scenes have been seen, or but it's I guess again this sort of like reusing of old mythology that again is kind of mocked or satirized, or I don't know. It's kind of funny. I hope we are not trapped in this matrix of like we need to replicate always like the past imagery, to make sense of our current story. I feel like at times that's why I like maybe abstractions of like often not more than figuration, but often I do feel like it's a fresh, like when I see him athlete, I feel it's like a fresh look into the art history,
Yeah.
or like Kandinsky or Pollock, or like later Roscoe, or I don't know. Or even here you have Terrazas, who makes like incredible like geometric patterns that was sort of influenced by sort of the abstract movements in Europe, and was shaped during the Olympics. So it was like a very funny, I guess, cool moment to be around here in Mexico City. But yeah, I hope we are not just trapped, that we can leave and say like, okay, guys, like we were able to make something else. So I'm not sure we've done that yet, in a while.
Yeah.
I feel like.
I think that there are always new objects though that are appearing in the world because of like industrializations. I think I include them in a painting that could otherwise be quite timeless. So I think I agree with you. I think it's worth like updating just to whatever extent you can.
Yeah.
But I mean, it can feel forced unless it happens. I wouldn't want to like try and represent my characters in an AI office on their lunch break or something. I don't think it needs to be like so time specific.
What other Mexican artists do you like? You like you said Rivera, you said Calo, very classical.
I think that I love the muralists. It's so exciting, like the idea of the art being for the people, not for the commissioned elite. There's definitely I went to see a mural that Philip Guston had made in Morelia that I think it was Siqueiros who had helped commission it while he'd been interning for him. But watching his interpretation of how the Mexican muralists were working, and he was trying out the fresco technique on this building in Morelia. But yeah, seeing the way that Siqueiros sort of cuts through classical architectural lines of vision is amazing. I think he's really incredible.
Yeah, I think from a Mexican perspective, he's probably he's such a problematic figure, not maybe in a political way as with other painters or thinkers, but more because his work, he was such an emblematic painter, and made so many murals as well, and temples almost around Mexico, but also in the U.S. and his connection there. He was a teacher of Pollock. He was a massive painter that should be worth more than many other painters that I see are, in super high prices and etc.
Yeah.
But he's also the most plagiarized artist here, so it's kind of funny, and it all has to do with his practice and his students, and that he just let them paint his stuff at some point.
But do you mean that also the application being on walls, not on canvases, means that the resale of them has changed his value over time?
Yeah, I guess muralism in itself is a complicated thing to it's not so consumerist, I would say. It's hard to sell a mural. And he was painting a lot in mainly walls, but also he did make up so many canvases, but just they were just imitated and remade. And today I've seen so many replicas that attempt to make it an original, but it's such a strange thing to see, the aftermath of his life and how people are still sort of in conflict about his works and what is true or what not, so. But he was, maybe as important for sure as Rivera, or Calo is very famous, but Siqueiros for sure should be, Orozco of course as well, etc.
Yeah, I love the Orozco mural of Malinche and Cortez.
Yeah.
I really love that image. I always go and see it when I get to Mexico City.
And contemporary ones, do you?
I really like Anna Segovia. I think
Okay.
it was really fun watching her be a figurative painter.
Yeah.
Like sort of, I saw a show of hers at Karen Huber, like
Yeah.
about 6 years ago, 7, and thinking it's exciting that she was
she
sticking
grew
to
a lot.
figuration.
Yeah.
Well, there wasn't quite a moment for it yet, and
Yeah.
I think she's great. I love the way
She was ahead of her times, maybe.
Mm.
Okay, so if you could think of a painter, writer, thinker, scientist, whoever it is, from the past, who would you have a conversation with?
Philip Guston.
Yeah,
Definitely.
he's your main reference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun. And what would you ask Philip?
Maybe what we were talking about, like, does he think it's worth trying to make new images? Or is it just the action of coming back to the painting that's important if you're a painter? Because it seems like it comes down to such a kind of simplified series of symbols at the end of his work. It's just like a big thumb coming down from the air, or like a big pencil. He simplifies so much. But I wonder what he'd say to someone like carrying on, because that he just happened to get to that point when his life ended. Maybe he'd have gone further.
Okay. Interesting. But that time period interests you specifically? So like 30s to 60s or?
Yeah, in New York. I think if I could go somewhere and make work, it would be there and then, probably.
In the 50s, 60s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd stand much of a chance, but I think it would be interesting to be at those
Tough
parties.
luck.
Talk to those
Maybe
people.
with a time machine, you know. So you did mention that you take quite some inspiration from cinema and other books. Like, what are other films that you find inspiration in, or directors, or give me a bunch.
I'm trying to think what I've watched recently. I think films which are very sort of intimate depictions of of sort of personal relationships, like After Sun, that style. Did you see that came out recently?
No, I don't think.
It's just a really like touching and quite kind of difficult portrait of like a father and his daughter. I like it. What else have I watched recently that I liked? I sort of can't think of anything. Sorry.
What about directors?
Well, I like the kind of.
Well, I was thinking, Call Me by Your Name sounds like this type of movies, or
Yeah, I guess so.
Moonlight. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh, that's a great film. I feel like for your palette, like
okay,
color, yeah, more blues and stuff like that. It seems interesting.
It's called Moonlight. Yeah, I just can't, my memory can't work right now.
Yeah. No direct. And how about books? Apart from this one, we're aware of Octavio Paz.
I think I like to read about sort of cultural theory. I'm not really going through a phase of reading much fiction.
Okay.
And kind of forcing myself to read something to put me into a kind of fictional headspace. But I think that what I'm enjoying is reading something like Susan Sontag or Kay Tempest and thinking about like a connection to society in time. And then while I'm painting, those figures are I'm thinking about their cultural connection, not a kind of story. I don't know. It helps me at the moment. Maybe part of this transition from being interested in more surreal into very.
Okay, Tempest, is she not the rapper, like British rapper?
Yeah, they're a spoken word artist, but also a writer. And this book on connection is it's just a really short series of essays, basically, but it kind of makes you think about the way you look, or it's kind of like an updated version of Ways of Seeing or something, but in a more emotional. Do you know that John Berger book, written in the 70s? It's about like ways you engage visually, basically.
I love Kate Tempest. I've been listening to her spoken word, you say?
Yeah.
For me, it's rap, but
Yeah, probably as well.
but yeah, I mean, she's really trippy. No? Like she can really make you feel like you're crossing the universe with every new rhythm or rhyme or I don't
and
know.
they make you
It's just
engage in
trippy.
like ideas on ecology or like
Yeah, exactly.
politics that from a new angle. I also love Olivia Lang. I feel like she has this amazing intersectional way of kind of weaving. It feels like a memoir, and then it's suddenly full of amazing historical facts, and then a very like fictional sort of depiction of the place she's in to get you there. And I think there's a book called Everybody, a book about freedom, and that made me think about I I don't know, about just empathy in general on the human body in a way that no one else had made me sort of understand. That kind of through being a feminist, you can understand some of the sides of affliction of some of racism in a way that really needs to be bridged. But I think she's a brilliant writer. I love her.
Yeah, awesome. What about other? I mean, I'm a big fan of William Blake, for example.
Yeah, me too.
British writer, a poet, a painter.
Yeah, I
Fantastic
mean, I
painter.
like him as a painter particularly.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Very magical stuff.
Yeah.
And unique. No, I've never seen anything like that. Somehow.
I think his kind of mysticism like got me towards surrealism back in the day. Yeah.
Because he was different. I feel like he was just part of
very
his own movement
visionary.
almost.
Yeah. I go between my house to my studio in London past Peckham Rye, which is where he supposedly had this sighting of angels. And I love the feeling of like imagining his visions around the places that I go to in the UK. He really makes you expand your vision when in different natural places.
Crazy.
So I definitely agree with you. He's an amazing creator.
And what about Aldous Huxley, for example?
Yeah, The Doors of Perception was a very interesting book. I loved it when I read it. And Brave New World is great. Yeah, I think that I did my thesis at the end of my illustration degree on whether you can kind of like the argument between Dali and Freud of whether you could be drawing from your subconscious or not. And within that time, I looked at Huxley quite a lot because I guess, him writing through that mescaline trip is a version of that.
Yeah, amazing
attempt. Yeah.
Okay. I took a class like when I was in uni as well, like on British poetry, like from when was it? I think it was from like the end of the 17th century until like late 19th. And it was just so shocking to see this period maybe reflected in England or Britain in general, because it felt like the world was really accelerating at the time. The loss of mysticism was occurring, at least a very religious mysticism, and somehow like a more polytheist or pagan thing was happening also with the arrival of technology and industrialization and all that. So I remember reading like I believe Shelley, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Blake, and some others that for me were incredibly transformative, and somehow I haven't seen anyone being able to write that style. So it's funny how some art movements become fossilized, perhaps like just because of their context, and you can never replicate them fully,
Yeah, I think that age of the Enlightenment will never happen again. I mean, if people were kind of thinking about it in the right way, AI could be forming those same sorts of reactions, I guess. But it's interesting actually in the book, in the Labyrinth of Solitude, how they talk about those ideas, those like intellectual ideas translating it into how the colonizing happens. I found that so interesting.
Yeah.
Looking at how like Spain's relationship to religion versus England's relationship to Christianity meant that the way they colonized and evangelized was different. That exact time was like reflected in the way that these new civilizations were formed. I hadn't really thought about that until reading this book. But the way that when England was was colonizing North America, they didn't give anyone indigenous a place in the church.
Yeah, right.
Because the Church of England doesn't offer that. Whereas in Catholicism, no matter what caste or level you are, in the obvious disparity of caste that was being established in the colonizing of Mexico, but there was still he was still given a place within the church, and the equivalent of that for an indigenous Mexican being in the cosmic order is a huge difference between your sense of existence or not, and the acknowledgement of you being part of being or not. I found that really
disturbing.
Yeah. really guilty, guilt-inducing.
Yeah, it is funny, I think. Not funny, sorry. It's
just the really crazy difference, yeah.
Yeah, but it just marks the way that perhaps, for example, I think a simple distinction between perhaps more North America, but really Northeast, and Mexico sort of developed in such a different way.
Yeah.
Clearly, that side was kind of, English and Dutch at the beginning, and then I found out, we went to New York recently, and I found out that Manhattan was actually the hunting ground for the what is it, the Cherokee or the Apache? I'm not sure. I don't want to misrepresent them, but it was called Mannahatta. It was so it's completely a native word, which now represents basically the wealthiest bunch in the U.S.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
So it's kind of a strange thing to think of course, when this colonization happened. I mean, it's but it was very different in Mexico for sure. I mean, we kind of became this culture that, despite the differences and the violence and repression and religious differences and all that, sort of also adapted it. Because I think what Catholicism has in this regard, with this I mean, when Catholicism accepts other people into the religion, they basically add new saints and new virgins to the story, right? Which are usually the gods of the locals, changed into a name that is Catholic or Christian, right?
Like San Juan Chumula.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, that's a practice that began really with the soldiers of the legions in Rome, when they would, fight the Gauls or the Celts, maybe around Britain even. And the soldiers wouldn't really make people believe in the gods, but they would bring them home to Rome, for example, so that suddenly the pantheon of gods just became broader, and it was just accepted. So it's funny how that also became a syncretic practice with the Catholic tradition, which sort of inherited that perhaps modus operandi.
Yeah, I know it's crazy in San Juan Chumula, that the idea that a polytheistic structure can then be translated into saints, as you say. That still the same rituals are happening for that community.
Or something of a kind. I'm not sure if they're really the original ones, or I think it's tough to find.
But they certainly aren't Europeanly Catholic. But the rituals that are happening, they're definitely an adaptation through time from what I saw. And it's extraordinary to see it disguised and adapted into a way that sustained a pre-Hispanic way of religion.
Yeah. So I think we're in the end of our podcast. But thank you for coming, Kitty. It was a pleasure. And good luck in the exhibition.
Thanks so much.
We'll be monitoring. Yeah. the exhibition. Yeah. So
Thanks so much for having me.
no, it was awesome.
Any, I don't know, Instagram or
Yeah. Do find us in AnthropoidEthos Art Advisor and at Joss on Instagram. And Kitty, do you
My
have
Instagram is kitty_rice_.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.